7 days. That is the length of time it took for the town of Prosperity Creek to die, and for 2 of its daughters to be reborn as something else entirely. It began not with a thunderclap or a tremor, but with the quiet, rhythmic slap of wet clay against a window pane. Annalise and Sabine, twins of 17 years, worked in silent unison under a sky the color of a faded cornflower. Their cabin, inherited from a grandmother the town had called both wise and witchy, sat at the edge of the settlement, just where the tamed dirt of the main street gave way to the untamed scrub of the plains. They moved with an unsettling synchronicity, one sister scooping the thick, grey mud from a wooden bucket, the other spreading it in a smooth, thick layer across the seams of every window, pressing it deep into the frame, obscuring the view, sealing the world out. Or in. Alastair Finch, proprietor of the town's only general store, was the first to notice. He paused his wagon, the leather reins loose in his hands, and watched them for a long moment. He saw not 2 girls preparing for winter, but an affront to progress. His own store boasted 2 large panes of glass, shipped all the way from St. Louis, a testament to Prosperity Creek's bright future. Annalise, Sabine, he called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who controlled the flow of salt and sugar. That's a peculiar sort of corking you're using. Annalise, the one who faced him, did not stop her work. Her hands, caked in grey, continued to smooth the clay. It's what grandmother taught us. Your grandmother was a fine woman, Finch said, a careful diplomatic note in his voice. But times change. We have proper glazing putty now. Seals tight, lets the light in. That looks like you're trying to turn your home into a burial mound. Sabine, her back to him, spoke without turning. Her voice was lower, calmer. The light will be the least of our concerns, Mr. Finch. Finch chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. He shook his head, a gesture of pity for the poor, orphaned girls, lost to the old, superstitious ways. He clucked at his horses and rolled on, the story already forming on his lips, a fine piece of morning gossip to be traded for a shave at the barber's. The town, he knew, would find it amusing. They were a modern people, after all. They had a telegraph line. They had glass windows. They had no need for mud. The story, as Mr. Finch predicted, took root and bloomed across Prosperity Creek with the speed of a prairie fire. It was Mrs. Gable who tended it most lovingly. A woman whose porch served as the town's unofficial watchtower, she made it her business to understand the peculiar workings of her neighbors. She saw the sisters next, not at their cabin, but hauling a heavy logging axe back from the smithy. It was a felling axe, brutally functional, its new steel head gleaming. Mrs. Gable was arranging her prize-winning chrysanthemums when she called to them, her voice sweet as honey laced with arsenic. Goodness, girls, what a fearsome tool. Are you planning on clearing the whole county for firewood? Annalise shifted the weight of the axe on her shoulder. We have enough firewood. This is for inside. This pronouncement was met with a confused silence. Mrs. Gable's perfectly manicured hand stilled above a yellow blossom. Inside? Heavens, child, you don't split firewood in the parlor. You'll ruin the floorboards. Sabine stopped and looked directly at Mrs. Gable, her eyes a flat, calm grey that seemed to absorb the light. We won't be splitting wood with it, she said, and then offered nothing more. The lack of explanation was more damning than any strange reasoning could have been. It was secretive. It was unnatural. The tale grew. The sisters were not just sealing their windows, they were hoarding tools for some unspeakable purpose. By noon, the story was that they were fortifying their home. By dusk, it was whispered they feared a siege. Their grief over their grandmother's passing a year prior was re-examined. It was no longer seen as simple mourning, but as a descent into madness. They were becoming recluses, walling themselves up with their strange memories and stranger habits. Deputy Holt, a young man who still felt the newness of his tin star, was dispatched for a wellness check. He found them stacking the last of their firewood not in the woodshed, but against the interior walls of their main room, creating a dense, insulated barrier. Girls, he said, his hat in his hands, his discomfort palpable. Folks are concerned. Sealing the windows, keeping an axe by the hearth, it's not typical. Annalise looked at the neatly stacked wood, then at the deputy. What is typical, deputy? believing the sky will always be kind. Sabine added, her voice soft but clear from across the room, buy an axe, deputy. A heavy one. Keep it inside, not in the garage. The deputy stammered a thank you, backed out of the strange, dim cabin, and reported to the mayor that the girls were peculiar, but harmless. The town, however, had already reached its verdict. They were mad. And so, the community watched and whispered, their judgment a low, constant hum beneath the rhythms of daily life, a collective assurance of their own sanity. Mayor Thompson represented the pinnacle of Prosperity Creek's self-regard. He was a man whose optimism was a political tool, a force he used to build a town in his own image, forward-looking, rational, and entirely dismissive of the past. He saw the sisters' behavior not as a private eccentricity, but as a public challenge to the narrative of progress he so carefully curated. He decided to address it head-on, with the most powerful weapon in his arsenal, public ridicule. The opportunity came during the annual Founders' Day market. The town square was bustling, a vibrant tapestry of commerce and community. The mayor, officiating a charity auction, spotted Annalise and Sabine moving through the crowd. They were not there for jams or quilts, they were buying enormous sacks of oats and beans, far more than two young women could reasonably consume. Seizing the moment, Mayor Thompson paused the bidding. Friends, neighbors, he boomed, his voice silencing the crowd. He pointed a jovial finger toward the twins. Let's give a hand to the sisters, who seem to be preparing for a winter longer than any of us can remember. A ripple of laughter spread through the square. The sisters stopped, their faces impassive. Tell me, girls, the mayor continued, playing to his audience, with the windows sealed and the pantry full, what are you building in there, a dam? More laughter, louder this time. Annalise met his gaze. We are preparing, Mayor. As our grandmother taught us, the mention of the old woman sent a fresh wave of knowing smirks through the onlookers. Ah yes, the old ways, Mayor Thompson said, his tone dripping with condescension. Well, in the spirit of helping our more traditional citizens, I have something for you. He reached under the auctioneer's table and produced a small, handsome hatchet with a polished handle and a lacquered head, an item intended for the charity raffle. He held it up. To help with that indoor wood splitting. The crowd roared. It was a perfect, piercing joke. He strode over and offered it to them. Sabine looked at the decorative tool, then at the massive, functional axe they had at home. She shook her head once. We don't need that, she said. Her quiet refusal was a splash of cold water on the festive mood. The mayor's smile tightened. He had expected grateful, embarrassed acceptance. Instead, he got calm, unyielding rejection. He was left standing there, holding the useless little axe, his grand gesture of mockery deflated. He turned back to the crowd, forcing a laugh. Well, you can't help those who won't help themselves, he declared. The town laughed with him, but the moment had soured. The sisters, indifferent to the spectacle, paid for their goods and walked away, leaving the mayor on his stage, the symbol of their ridicule still in his hand. The days that followed seemed to prove the mayor and the town spectacularly right. The weather, which should have been turning sharp and cold, instead bloomed into a period of astonishing warmth. An Indian summer, the old-timers called it, a last, golden gift from the departing year. The sky remained a brilliant, cloudless blue. The sun felt warm on the skin, and the chill of the evening was no more than a gentle reminder to fetch a shawl. Prosperity Creek basked in it. The mockery of the sisters softened into a kind of gentle, communal pity. Their sealed, dark cabin, once a source of suspicion, now seemed merely pathetic. While the rest of the town threw their windows open to the balmy air, the sisters remained entombed in their self-made prison. Mrs. Gable hosted a garden party. Mayor Thompson organized a town picnic by the creek. Mr. Finch did a brisk trade in lemonade mix and light blankets. The world was mild and forgiving, and the collective wisdom of the community felt gloriously affirmed. Poor girls, Mrs. Gable was heard to say, fanning herself on her porch. All that work for nothing. They must feel terribly foolish in that stuffy, dark house. The deputy, Holt, felt a private, unacknowledged shame. He had purchased a new axe, a heavy one, just as Sabine had suggested. He hadn't brought it inside, of course, that was ridiculous, but he'd bought it. Now it sat in his shed, a monument to a moment of foolish gullibility. He felt like he had been taken in by a child's ghost story. He avoided looking toward the sister's cabin on his rounds. Its silent, grey-streaked facade was a reproach. Inside that cabin, the world was different. The air was cool and still. The clay had cured to the hardness of stone, and the only light came from tallow candles and the low, steady fire in the hearth. Anneliese and Sabine moved through their days with the same unhurried purpose. They checked the seals, organized their stores, and sat for long periods in the dim quiet, listening. They were not waiting for a storm. They were waiting for a debt to be paid. To them, the warmth outside was not a gift, it was a deception. It was the world taking a deep, slow breath before the scream. They heard it in the unnatural quiet of the birds, which had slowly vanished over the preceding week. They felt it in the strange pressure of the air, a weight that had nothing to do with humidity. The town celebrated its luck. The sisters sharpened their axe. The change came not at dawn or dusk, but in the dead of the afternoon, when the sun was at its highest. It began as a discoloration in the northern sky, a smudge of bruised purple on the horizon. It looked like a distant shower, nothing more. Within an hour, the smudge had consumed a quarter of the sky. The temperature, a pleasant 60 degrees at noon, had fallen to 40. The wind, which had been a gentle southern breeze, died completely. An absolute, profound silence descended upon Prosperity Creek. It was a silence so deep it felt like a pressure in the ears. The picnickers by the creek began to pack their baskets, a sudden, unspoken anxiety rippling through them. By 3 p.m., the sun was gone, blotted out by a rolling, slate-gray ceiling. The temperature was 32 degrees, the freezing point of water, and falling. The first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not the gentle, drifting flakes of a winter postcard. They were small, hard, and sharp, like grains of sand, driven by a wind that had sprung from nowhere with a low, predatory howl. By 3:30 p.m., the temperature was 15 degrees. The world outside the windows was a churning vortex of white. Visibility dropped to 0. It was no longer snowing, the air itself seemed to be crystallizing. Alastair Finch, struggling to bar the front door of his store against the wind, felt the brass handle burn his palm with cold. He watched in disbelief as a fine, web-like pattern of frost instantly bloomed across the inside of his magnificent plate glass windows. By 4 p.m., the temperature was 0. The howl of the wind had risen to a sustained, deafening shriek. It was the sound of a living thing, a vast and ancient rage. The town was plunged into a premature, terrifying darkness. Inside their homes, people scrambled to light lamps, their movements clumsy with a dawning horror. The cold was no longer outside. It was a physical presence, pouring through every crack, every seam, every pane of glass. It was a tangible enemy, and it was winning. At 4:17 p.m., the first window in town shattered. It was one of Mr. Finch's, the one facing north. It did not break with a crash, but with a sharp, sickening pop, like a bone snapping, as the thermal stress became too much. A roaring wave of ice-laden air exploded into his store, extinguishing his lantern and plunging him into a maelstrom of absolute cold and darkness. The night that followed was not a measure of time, but of endurance. For the people of Prosperity Creek, trapped in their modern, well-lit homes, it was a slow, agonizing education in the nature of true cold. The blizzard was not a weather event, it was a geological one. The snow, driven by the hurricane-force wind, did not accumulate in soft drifts. It impacted, compacted, and froze, layer by infinitesimal layer, into a substance with the density of cement. By midnight, the temperature outside was 40 degrees below 0. The world had ceased to exist. There was only the sound of the wind and the relentless, crushing pressure of the ice. Mrs. Gable sat huddled in her parlor, wrapped in every blanket she owned, and still she shook with a cold so deep it felt like it was emanating from her own bones. Her beautiful windows were opaque with a thick, fern-like layer of interior frost. A low, groaning sound came from her front door. She thought at first it was the wind, but the sound was too steady, too structural. It was the sound of the wood and iron of her house contracting, surrendering to the impossible cold. When she tried to feed her stove, she found her small woodshed, located just off the back porch, was inaccessible. The door was sealed shut by a wall of ice. Her indoor supply, a small basket of decorative birch logs, would not last till morning. Mayor Thompson fared no better in his large, two-story house. The cold poured through his half-dozen windows as if they were open holes. He and his wife had dragged their mattress into the kitchen, the smallest, most defensible room, and huddled around the cast-iron cookstove. But the stove was a ravenous beast, and his woodpile was across the yard. Earlier, he had tried to open the kitchen door. It wouldn't budge. He had thrown his shoulder against it, then kicked it, his panic rising. It was like kicking a cliff face. The ice had welded it to its frame. He remembered the small, decorative hatchet he had tried to give the sisters, now sitting by his fireplace as a conversation piece. He fetched it. The first blow against the solid oak door just bounced off, the lacquered head barely scratching the wood. The second blow sent a jarring shock up his arm, and the handle, never meant for real work, cracked in his hand. He was trapped. The symbol of his mockery was now the symbol of his utter impotence. Inside the sisters' cabin, a different reality prevailed. The roaring of the wind was a distant, muted hum, the sound of a faraway sea. The thick clay seals, now frozen to the consistency of granite, had made the small structure virtually monolithic. The interior walls, lined with cords of firewood, provided a dense layer of insulation. The air inside was cool, but it was a livable, breathable cool, maintained by the small, efficient fire in the stone hearth. There was no frost on the inner walls. No draft snaked across the floor. Annalise and Sabine sat on opposite sides of the hearth, wrapped in wool blankets, sharing a pot of bean soup. They moved with a placid economy of motion, wasting no energy, speaking only when necessary. The cabin was their ark, a tiny vessel of preserved knowledge floating on a sea of frozen chaos. They were not afraid. They were not triumphant. They were simply enduring, enacting a ritual they had been taught since they were children. Their grandmother had told them stories of a winter like this, one that came once in a man's lifetime, a white hurricane that could strip the bark from trees and freeze a running steer in its tracks. She had taught them to read the signs, the behavior of the birds, the color of the late autumn sky, the feel of the air. And she had taught them the preparations. The clay, she had explained, was not just a sealant. It was a second skin for the house, porous enough to prevent the logs from sweating and rotting, but dense enough to become an impenetrable barrier when frozen. The wood inside was not just fuel, it was armor against the cold. The axe was not for splitting wood, it was for getting out. The ice will give your door to the earth, she had told them. You will need a stronger key to take it back, and so they waited, listening to the muffled fury of the storm, husbanding their resources, secure in the quiet, absolute certainty of their grandmother's wisdom. The town had called her a witch. They had called them mad. But sanity, they now understood, was simply a measure of who was left standing when the storm passed. For 3 days, the world remained frozen. The wind eventually died down, but the cold held, locking Prosperity Creek in a tomb of ice and snow. The silence that followed the storm was more terrifying than the wind had been. It was the silence of a graveyard. From the second story of the mayor's house, Deputy Holt, who had weathered the storm in a small room at the jail, could see the new landscape. The town was gone. In its place was a rolling, alien terrain of white, sculpted by the wind into waves and crests. Only the tops of the steepest roofs were visible. Every door, every first-floor window, was buried under 10 feet of snow that had the consistency of packed ice. A profound sense of despair settled over him. They were all buried alive. Then he remembered the sisters. Their cabin, set lower than the rest of the town, was likely completely submerged. But he also remembered Sabine's words, "Keep it inside." He looked at the heavy felling axe he had bought, which he had kept in his office. It was his only hope. It took him 2 hours of brutal, exhausting work to shatter the ice-sealed frame of the second-story window. Once outside, the scale of the disaster was even more apparent. The air was so cold it was painful to breathe. He began the slow, torturous journey toward the sisters' cabin, walking on the frozen crust of the snow. The 300 yards took him nearly an hour. He found the location by memory, a slight depression in the snow where the roof should be. There was no sign of life. He felt a surge of guilt and dread. His skepticism, the town's skepticism, had left them to die. Then he saw it. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke, rising from a narrow hole in the snow. It was coming from their chimney. They were alive. He began to dig with his hands, then with the butt of his axe, his movements frantic. He uncovered the top of the roof, then the peak of the front wall. He found the door, or where the door should be, buried under a solid wall of ice-hard snow. He hammered on the roof with his axe handle. "Anneliese! Sabine! Are you in there?" A muffled sound came from within. A scraping. A thudding. Then, a section of the door seemed to splinter inward, and he could see the dim, flickering light from inside. They were chopping their way out. He joined them, swinging his own axe, the heavy steel biting deep into the ice-packed snow. Together, from both sides, they carved a tunnel. When the opening was large enough, Holt dropped into the cabin. The warmth was the first thing that hit him, a wave of life-giving heat that felt like a physical blow. The air smelled of wood smoke and simmering soup. The two sisters, their faces smudged with soot, looked at him calmly. There was no accusation in their eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, solemn appraisal. Anneliese nodded toward the axe in his hand. "You listened," she said. It was not a question. "Not enough," Holt replied, his voice hoarse. "The others, they're trapped." "The mayor?" Finch, everyone. Sabine ladled a steaming cup of broth and handed it to him. Her movements were steady, her hand did not tremble. "The cold is the first enemy," she said, her grandmother's teachings flowing from her as if by rote. "The second is panic. The third is hunger. You must conquer them in that order for the next hour." They gave him instructions. It was a litany of survival, a catechism of the cold. They told him how to find the north-facing doors, where the ice would be thickest and most brittle. They told him to listen for sounds from within, to focus on the houses where children were. They explained how to tunnel, not down, but sideways, to relieve the pressure on the walls. They gave him 2 wrapped parcels of cooked beans and dried meat. "Give this to those who are weakest," Anneliese instructed. "Energy is more important than a full belly." They handed him a small bundle of tallow-dipped rags. "For light. Fear grows in the dark." He was no longer a deputy. He was their instrument. He was the bridge between their sealed-off sanctuary of wisdom and the frozen, desperate town that had mocked them. He looked at these 2 17-year-old girls, who had faced the apocalypse with nothing more than inherited knowledge and a refusal to bend to public opinion. He felt a profound, humbling awe. "You survived," he said, the words inadequate. Sabine looked at the clay-sealed walls, the stacked wood, the still-glowing hearth. "Grandmother survived," she corrected. "We just followed the instructions." Holt climbed back out of the tunnel, the sisters' words echoing in his mind, the weight of his mission settling on his shoulders. He was not just rescuing his town, he was carrying a gospel of survival, and its prophets were 2 girls the world had dismissed as mad. The thaw came 4 days later, as slowly and grudgingly as the freeze had come with violence. The sun returned, a pale, watery disk in a washed-out sky. The great melt began. It was not a gentle process. The world wept. Water dripped from every surface, carving channels through the ice, revealing the drowned town beneath. The sounds of Prosperity Creek returned, not as the cheerful bustle of life, but as the groaning of stressed wood, the sharp crack of shifting ice, and the low murmur of exhausted, grieving voices. The cost was staggering. Not everyone had survived. The cold had been a merciless judge, and it had found many wanting. Those who had lived were changed, their faces etched with a new, stark humility. Mayor Thompson emerged from his house gaunt and silent, his easy charisma stripped away, leaving only a hollowed-out shell of a man. Mrs. Gable refused to leave her home for a month, her porch, once the seat of judgment, now a place of silent, solitary penance. The survivors moved like ghosts through the wreckage of their town, their certainty shattered, their pride frozen and broken along with their windows. The sisters' cabin became a focal point. People didn't knock. They approached the edge of the clearing where it stood, leaving offerings on a large, flat stone, a sack of flour, a side of bacon, a newly forged shovel. They were not payments. They were confessions. They were acts of contrition offered to the silent, Mud Street house. Annalise and Sabine accepted them without ceremony. They did not gloat. They did not preach. They simply continued their lives, their quiet resilience a more powerful sermon than any words could be. They became the town's keepers of a truth it had almost died forgetting, that progress is a fragile veneer, and that beneath it lies an older, harder world that does not bargain. The final, enduring image of that winter was not one of devastation, but of quiet reverence. It was the sight of Deputy Holt, no longer a boy playing at authority but a man forged by crisis, splitting firewood for the sisters. He worked in the clearing, the steady thud of his axe a rhythmic heartbeat in the quiet air. He was not repaying a debt. He was learning a language, a forgotten tongue of preparation and respect, ensuring that the next time the sky turned purple, someone else would be ready to listen.